At some point, many of us are going to want to learn to play some new songs and some different scales. And with the native flute, a really common way to do that is through fingering tablature. And another common way is through what's called Untitled Tablature. So in this section, I'll go over how both of those two things work and the benefits of each. Fingering tablature has been around for a long time, and it's a great way to learn different songs and some new scales. It's pretty easy and straightforward, and you don't need a lot of background to learn it. There's two components to it. There's a picture of a flute that shows you which holes are open and which holes are closed, and then there's a number associated with that flute that tells you how long to sustain the note. Here's an example of what the flute drawings often look like. However, there are many variations on this theme. But no matter what the drawing looks like, there needs to be two main components. You always need a mouthpiece and the fingering holes. All high spirits fingering charts will use black holes to represent fingering holes that are covered and white holes to represent fingering holes that are going to be left open. So in this example, the bottom three holes would be open and the top three holes would be closed. When learning scales, this is all that will need to be shown because there isn't any specific melody associated with the scale. However, when you're learning songs, there will be a number placed at the bottom of each flute that represents how long that note is sustained. So here is the tablature for Amazing Grace. Notice the numbers at the bottom of each flute. If we zoom in, we see that the first note is held for 1 beat, the second note for 2 beats, and the third for a half a beat, and so on. Here we see a number followed by a plus sign. The plus symbol represents a half a beat added onto the number that sits next to it. So for example, this note is held for 1.5 beats. In general, it is assumed that you will tongue whenever you are changing notes. If this is not the case, this symbol, this upside down arch, will be used to bracket in the notes that you will slur. So remember that slurring is when you don't tongue while changing notes. When it comes to how long a beat will last, that's really up to you. And so in the beginning, you're going to want to go really slow. So for example, like slow like this, like. And what that does is it allows you enough time to really look at everything, find new fingering, and get to that before the next beat happens. So, and then as you become more comfortable, you'll speed up until you find that you can speed up enough to where it feels like it sounds right to you. So for example, if I'm learning to play Amazing Grace, I might start with a really slow beat like this. And you can tap your foot. That's always really helpful for keeping a beat. So then as you start learning the song more and you start memorizing the notes and the rhythm, you can start playing it faster and faster until it becomes to the speed that you like and feel comfortable with and you like the sound of. Now, fingering tablature is really useful for learning new songs and for learning scales. It's very intuitive and it's easy, it's very visual, there's not a lot of components to it. Now, where Untitled Tablature comes in is when you're writing music. So fingering tablature can be a little tedious because each note you have to mark off all the holes that you want closed. So where Untitled Tablature shines is here because it's really quick. And so in the next section we'll go over Untitled Tablature and how to use that. Nakai tablature was developed by Carlos Nakai as a way to adapt written music to the native flute. One of the biggest advantages of it is that with one symbol, you can represent both the pitch of the note that you're going to play as well as the rhythm, how long that note is going to be held. And if you don't already read music, then it can be a little bit challenging. There can be a little bit of a learning curve because there are quite a few symbols and conventions to memorize in order to use it. But if you do feel like you're going to write down a lot of music, or you find that's happening where you're writing down a lot of songs, then you might want to give it a try. Now, if it's not something that you're that interested in, or you have some other ways of writing down your songs that work well for you, then go ahead and skip this section and go right on to the section on songbooks. To start with, I'll go over some of the components of written music. The lines and spaces on which music is written is called the staff. This symbol is called a clef, and specifically, this is a treble clef. There is also a bass clef, but because the native flute is not considered a bass instrument, you will always see the treble clef associated with Nakai tablature. This is the key signature. The number of symbols that you see in this section will tell you the key that the song is in. Now in Nakai tablature, this space will always have 4 sharps because the most common tuning for the native flute is the key of F sharp in what's called a Dorian mode. Now what the key signature specifically tells us, besides just the key that the song is in, it tells us which notes within the song will always be sharp throughout it. So any notes on these lines or in these spaces, like this one and this one, will always be sharp throughout the song because the key signature has a sharp in that line and in that space. This is a note. The circle part of a note will sit either in a space or on a line. In traditional written music, each space or line represents a specific note. But in the Nakai tablature, each space and line represents a specific native flute fingering. So for example, a note in this space represents all the holes closed. No matter what key your flute is in, a note here always represents all the holes closed. This is very different from traditional written music, where the note is in this position represents a specific note and not a specific fingering. The fingering will differ depending on the instrument you're playing. But with Nakai tablature, it always represents a specific fingering. This aspect of Nakai tablature makes it so that the same sheet of music can be used for any native flute, no matter what key it's in. Otherwise, we would have to make a different sheet of music for each flute in each key. Here's a key that shows all the notes that are associated with Nakai tablature and the fingerings that each represents. You can find this chart in the booklet that comes with this video. You'll notice that some of the notes have a sharp or a natural symbol next to them. When we see these symbols like this, they're called accidentals. Accidentals are notes that deviate from the information given in the key signature. In essence, what these accidentals tell us is that this one note has a different fingering from any of the other notes that are in the same space or line. For example, this note represents only the hole on the bottom being open. When the accidental is added, the fingering changes to only the second hole from the bottom being opened. So the accidental changes it to a different fingering. So where the note sits on the staff and whether or not it has an accidental tells us what fingering to play. Next, we'll go over how the shape of the note tells us the rhythm to play. The length of time that each note or rest is sustained creates the rhythm in a melody. And it's the shape of a note or a rest symbol that tells us how long to sustain that note or rest for. Here's a chart that shows the most common notes used in Nakai tablature: a whole note, a half note, a quarter note, and an eighth note. These names are based off the whole note itself. So to keep things simple, we will say that the whole note always gets 4 beats. A half note, which gets half the number of beats that the whole note gets, would get 2 beats. A quarter note, which gets a quarter of the number of beats that a whole note gets 1 beat. And an eighth note gets an eighth of the number of beats that a whole note gets, so it would end up getting a half a beat. The same goes for rests. A whole rest gets 4 beats, a half a rest gets 2 beats, a quarter rest gets 1 beat, and an eighth rest gets a half a beat. One thing to notice is when there are multiple eighth notes in a row, they are tied together with a line like this. You can find this chart in the booklet that comes with this video. So now let's look at some actual sheet music. Here is Amazing Grace written in Untitled Tablature. You'll notice that there are some things on here that I haven't gone over. Let's look over them now. This is what's called the time signature. The top number tells us how many beats each measure can have in it. So in this case, each measure can only have 3 beats in it. The only exception to this is the very first measure right here. Besides this, you'll notice that each measure has only 3 beats in it. For example, here we have a half note which gets 2 beats and a quarter note which gets 1 beat. Add them together and you get 3 beats within this measure. Let's look at one more. Here we have a half note which gets 2 beats and an eighth note followed by another eighth note, each of which gets a half a beat. So together they equal 1 beat. So you have the 2 beats, the 2 half beats, so altogether you get 3 beats within this measure. If the top number of the time signature happened to be 4, which is really common, then each measure would have 4 beats in it instead of 3. The bottom number in the time signature represents the note that gets the beat. Now in the Untitled Tablature, this number rarely changes, so for sake of simplicity, I'm going to just leave it at that. If you'd like to learn more about time signatures, there's a ton of information online. The next thing we'll look at is this dotted quarter note. The dot represents an addition of half the note that it sits next to. So for example, a quarter note gets 1 beat. So that means that the dot represents half of what a quarter note gets. So that would be half a beat. So together this note gets 1.5 beats. Here's another example. This is a dotted half note. Because a half note gets 2 beats, then the dot represents half of that, which is 1 beat. So in all, this dotted half note gets 3 beats. This symbol is called a tie. A tie connects 2 notes that are the same. And essentially what it means is that instead of tonguing between the notes, you just add them together. For example, under this tie, there's a dotted half note which gets 3 beats and a half note which gets 2 beats. So in total, you would play this note for 5 beats. If a tie connects 2 different notes, like in this example, it's called a slur. Now remember that slurring between notes means that you don't tongue when you're changing the notes. You just slide between the 2 notes. It's good to remember that unless a tie or a slur is present, every note is tongued. So here's the Untitled Tablature for Amazing Grace. So those are the basics of Untitled Tablature. Now if you're learning this for the first time, be patient with yourself. It's a lot to memorize. There's a lot of symbols and conventions to learn. It's really just like learning to read all over again. It can be really useful, especially if you're going to be writing music. That's where it really shines. Songbooks are the perfect way to learn new songs. They're also a great way to expand your playing style by learning new note combinations and new rhythms. Now, all High Spirits songbooks have both Untitled Tablature and regular tablature written in them. Here's an example. As you can see, the regular tablature sits underneath the Untitled Tablature. This is helpful if you're interested in learning Untitled Tablature because you can associate the fingerings with the notes more easily. If you're not interested in that, you can just ignore the Untitled Tablature and use the regular tablature to learn the songs really easily. We hope this section on tablature has been helpful and provides you with the necessary tools to use either Nikai and/or regular tablature to expand your playing style.